friends, welcome to the 171st session of Legal Empowerment through Interaction lecture series. And we are just breaking the regular pattern. We are having a session on Friday because we have been doing it back to back in the first 100 sessions. Then we confined to Saturday and Sunday. But today, Friday, we have development of the law of promissory estoppel and legitimate expectation in India. None other than a wonderful speaker, Raman sir, senior advocate of the Chennai High Court, Madras High Court, and the former Advocate General of Tamil Nadu would be addressing us. And we are privileged with the presence of Justice Ramkumar sir, Justice Ramakrishnan sir, and all of you wonderful participants. I'm sorry for the delay in the sense because there was some connectivity problem, but henceforth there won't be any connectivity problem, I'm sure, once the session starts. Over to you, Raman sir.
Thank you, Shyam. Good evening, friends.
Good evening.
And for joining me today for the 171st Legal Empowerment through Interactive Lecture Series organized by Shyampadmanassociates. This concept of having webinars, and that's a new word in my lexicon, has really taken continuing legal education to a different level, and I believe that when settled down to normalcy in this country and elsewhere, some of the concepts like webinar will continue to thrive purely from their ease and economy of point of view. Having seen the list of speakers who have previously been addressing this august body, I am humbled and motivated to organize invitation to speak. And for this evening, my topic for discussion is the development of law of promissory estoppel and legitimate expectation in India. There are primarily two reasons for my choice of this topic. One of prudence and one of practice. Prudence stemmed from my going through the topics of previous lectures, wherein I found that a very vast gamut of subjects have already been dealt with, many of whom were ones I too would have liked to talk about. I felt that barring the discussion on law of evidence when some reference to estoppel may have been made, the subject of promissory estoppel and legitimate expectation in the realm of public law or administrative law had not been addressed as yet in this August forum. The second reason of practice was a few months before the national lockdown. I had an occasion to do a matter before the Madras High Court which involved both the doctrines, and my team and I had done some considerable work on this subject, and so it seemed a natural choice and an easy route, or so I thought. When I started preparing for this discussion, I realized that like in any other facet of law, this too was an ocean, and what we had researched was but a drop. So it was back to the grindstone. And I do hope that some of your legitimate expectations on this talk by me will be met. To better understand the doctrine of promissory estoppel, one needs to go to its root, which is the rule of estoppel by conduct. Estoppel, as a legal principle, has been a part of jurisprudence for centuries. Simply stated, what estoppel provides that if a person by his conduct or by his word or by his deed created a position to another person, he stopped from acting contrary to that position. However, this principle of estoppel by conduct has been applied in English law only as a shield and not a sword, implying that it cannot constitute a cause of action to enforce any right, but can only be used as a defense in any action, stop the plaintiff from taking any contrary position. Though it is often believed that the law of promissory estoppel has started with the celebrated judgment of Lord Denning in the High Trees case as a forerunner of the principle of promissory estoppel. In reality, the Master of Rolls, when he was sitting in the King's Bench in 1946, while laying down the principles of promise and estoppel, or what he called as principles of estoppel by conduct or deed, the Lord referred to earlier judgments of promise being enforced as long back as in 1854 in a case called Jordan versus Money. The judge, however, laments that since then the law has been standing still and then proceeded to decide the High Trees case. I was curious to know why such an important judgment like high trees, pronounced in 1946, was reported only 10 years later in 1956, Volume 1, All England Reports 256. I found to my surprise that Lord Denning decided high trees in his inimitably crisp fashion in less than 3 pages, with the passage on estoppel being hardly one paragraph. The judgment seems to have somehow sunk between the lines when it was passed in 1946. However, in 1955, sitting in the Court of Appeal, Lord Denning, sitting with Lord Justice Hodgson and Lord Justice Morris, gave a much more elaborate judgment on promissory estoppel, relying on his earlier pronouncement in high trees. This was in the case of Lyle Miller versus A. Lewis and Company. Lord Denning refers to the principle as the concept of new estoppel. The editors of All England Reports therefore dug out high trees and had it reported even today only as a note following the report on Lyle Miller. Even though, as mentioned by me earlier, English law did not recognize estoppel as a cause of action for a plaintiff, but ironically in Lyle Miller's case, it was pleaded by the plaintiff, for whom Lord Shyam appeared as a Queen's Counsel. The case, however, reflects that the plaintiff took up the plea in reply to a contrary positions taken by the defendant. So the English law that estoppel will not constitute a cause of action more or less remained constant, at least in the realm of civil law. On a reading of the above two judgments of Lord Denning, it transpires that his idea of a new rule of estoppel actually stems from two very old judgments and a comparatively recent one. The first is the House of Lords in the case of Hughes versus Metropolitan Railway Company. It's a 1877 judgment. And the second is of the Chancery Division in the case of Birmingham and District Land Company, which is a 1888 judgment. A more recent case was Salisbury versus Gilmore, which was in 1942. It's reported in 1942, 2 King's Bench, page 38. Lord Denning holds in high trees that the above referred cases, to quote him, show that a party will not be allowed to go back on a promise. The time has come for the validity of such a promise to be recognized. This rule of estoppel, spoken about in the English courts, recognizes 3 categories of estoppel. Firstly, estoppel by judgment. Secondly, estoppel by deed. And thirdly, estoppel in pace. Estoppel by judgment is the principle of res judicata, statutorily recognized in India under Section 11 of the Code of Civil Procedure 1908. Estoppel by deed basically applies to cases involving statements contained in written documents between parties. A minor variant of this, we could say, is in Section 43 of the Transfer of Properties Act, which embodies the English doctrine of feeding the grant by estoppel. We are today only with the third, namely estoppel in pace, or more familiarly speaking, estoppel without judicial proceeding, meaning in contradistinction to res judicata. Recognize this estoppel in pace or estoppel by conduct in Section 115 of the Indian Evidence Act, which provides as follows. When one person has, by his declaration, act or omission, intentionally caused or permitted another person to believe a thing to be true and to act upon such belief, neither he nor his representative shall be allowed in any suit or proceeding between himself and such person or his representative to deny the truth of that thing. This rule of estoppel by conduct was initially being only applied as a shield and not a sword, even in Indian courts, following the same principles of the English law. Reference may be made to one of those early decisions of the Privy Council in the case of Maritime Electric Company versus General Diaries, reported in AIR 1937 Privy Council 114. The Supreme Court first addressed itself the principle of to the principle of estoppel in the case of Dayan Singh versus Jugal Kishore, reported in AIR 1952 Supreme Court 145. But It was a case involving estoppel against an enforcement of an arbitral award. A few years later, in the case of Sahu Madhudas versus Pandit Mukundaram, reported in AIR 1955 Supreme Court 481, the Supreme Court held that the rule of estoppel was only a rule of evidence and that the doctrine of election, or more particularly popularly the rule of approbation and reprobation, is different, though in a way estoppel and election do have commonalities. Various courts, high courts, also started applying the principle of estoppel as a means to prevent fraud or to prevent injustice or injury to a party aggrieved by a contradictory stand of parties. One such case was a full bench of the Punjab and Haryana court in 1961, but similar views have been expressed by various other courts, Bombay, Calcutta, Madras, Allahabad. Indeed, a division bench of the Calcutta High Court, very interesting, had pronounced the judgment through Chief Justice Garth as long back as in 1880 in the case of Surajmal versus Ganges Manufacturing Company on the scope of estoppel by conduct, which judgment was approved 80 years later by the Supreme Court in the celebrated case of R.S. Madanappa versus Chandrama, reported in AR 1965 Supreme Court 1812. This was a case, that is Madanappa's case, was one concerning property disputes between family members. Here, there are some discussions on the doctrine of estoppel by conduct was addressed. However, since the parties had not altered their position by reason of the representation or conduct, the court refused to apply estoppel. However, what is important is that one of the contentions raised before the apex court was that the courts in India should apply the equitable estoppel principle of English law. And this was negatived by the bench by holding that it was very doubtful whether the courts in India, while determining whether the conduct of a party amounts to estoppel or not, could traverse beyond Section 115 of the Evidence Act. I was actually surprised. It appears that the attention of the three-judge bench in 1965 was actually not drawn to an earlier Constitution bench judgment of the court in the case of Collector of Bombay versus Bombay Municipal Corporation, reported in AR 1951 Supreme Court 469, where by a majority, Patanjali Shastri J alone dissented, held that being a court of equity, in order to prevent miscarriage of justice, the courts in India would go beyond the equitable principles of Section 115 of Evidence Act. I was surprised. It was truly an unusual oversight for those days. Since then, the trial courts in India have been consistently following the doctrine of estoppel by conduct in binding parties to their stand or representation made to one another. Another oft-quoted case on this point is that of Turner Morrison versus Hungerford Investments, 1972, 1 SEC 857, where the court discusses the real but fine distinction between estoppel, waiver, and abandonment. All these, as I mentioned, were in the realm of private law and dealt with the individual disputes and not with the state. This is where the law started developing on whether, like an individual, the state too could be held to any promise or representation made by it to the public. This became known by the term promissory estoppel. It is yet another common misconception, and I candidly admit to have been a victim of it myself, that the doctrine of promissory estoppel was propounded by the Supreme Court for the first time in the judgment authored by Justice Bhagavati, as his lordship then was, in the celebrated case of Motilal Badampat Sugar Mills versus State of UP, more popularly known as MP Sugar Mills case, reported in 1979, 2 SEC, page 409. In reality, there are three prior cases prior to Motilal Badampat. The first time the doctrine of promissory estoppel was used against the state was as long back as in 1951 in the earlier referred judgment of the Supreme Court in the case of Collector of Bombay versus Bombay Municipal Corporation. This was a case where certain lands in the possession of the Bombay Municipal Corporation were taken back by the state government on an assurance given to the corporation that the state government would put up buildings there and that the BMC would then be given the buildings free for use of public as an infrastructure facility. The state, however, reneged on the assurance and started demanding rent from BMC, leading for the BMC to sue the state. The corporation was suing the state. The matter finally reached the apex court, where the Constitution bench was presided by Justice S.R. Das, dealt with the doctrine of estoppel by adverting to the old English classics on the subject, 1886 decision called Ramsay versus Dyson. It's a very interesting case because Ramsay versus Dyson is one judgment which every judgment on promissory estoppel, if it is worth its salt, will somewhere trace itself to. Even High Trees refers to this judgment. The Supreme Court in this Bombay Municipal Corporation case elaborately discusses the applicability of the rule of estoppel against the state and finally holds that the state of Bombay was bound to honor its promise to the Bombay Corporation. What is more fascinating is that the Supreme Court cites and approves of a judgment of Chief Justice Jenkins, authored in 1905, sitting in a bench in the Bombay High Court in another case of the Bombay Municipal Corporation versus Secretary of State, reported in 1905 ILR Bombay 580, wherein the High Court, without using the expressions promissory estoppel or legitimate expectation, actually enforced the two doctrines against the state. The expression used by Chief Justice Jenkins were estoppel and representation. The expressions were most appropriate then and even today for if it's a estoppel based on a promise, it's promissory estoppel. And if it's an expectation which is reasonable or legitimate, it is legitimate expectation. And to think that Chief Justice Jenkins applied these two doctrines a good 7 decades before MP Sugar Mills case. The second occasion for estoppel being used against the state by the Supreme Court was in the case of Union of India versus Indo-Afghan agencies, reported in AR 1968 Supreme Court 718. This was a case where the government of India, as part of its export-import policy, committed to give certain benefits to exporters. Indo-Afghan was one such exporter who had fulfilled his obligations and wanted the reciprocal benefits promised by the government. But the Textile Commissioner denied the same, resulting in the dispute. The government of India took a position before the Supreme Court that it was not bound to give the benefits, citing executive necessity, and that in matters of imports and exports involving foreign exchange, the court should not interfere. The Supreme Court rejected the plea of executive necessity, citing Denning's famous quote, "Crown cannot escape estoppel." Very often when one uses search engines with the catchphrase promissory estoppel, the case of Indo-Afghan may not prop up because the judgment itself, again, as in the state of Bombay, never used that expression. The third occasion this doctrine was applied before MP Sugar Mills was in 1971 in the case of Century Spinning versus Ulhasnagar Municipality, reported in AR 1971 Supreme Court 1021. In this case, the petitioner had set up an industrial unit in Maharashtra, relying upon certain promises of tax benefits through octroi exemptions. When the industrial area in which the factory was located was to become part of the Ulhasnagar municipality, the local body also agreed to continue the promises made by the state government, but later by a resolution decided to impose the octroi. The Bombay court sustained the decision of the municipality. On appeal, this was the first time when the apex court drew a distinction between representation regarding an existing fact and a representation to do something in future. The apex court made reference to judgments in the Indo-Afghan case and held that public bodies were as much bound as private individuals to carry out representations of fact and promises made to do things in future as well. The crucial conclusion by the apex court was as follows. I quote, "If our nascent democracy is to thrive, different standards of conduct for the people and the public bodies cannot ordinarily be permitted. A public body is, in our judgment, not exempt from liability to carry out its obligations arising out of representations made by it, relying upon by a citizen who has altered his position to his prejudice. Here again, like the previous two cases, the expression promissory estoppel was not used, but instead the apex court used the expression raising an estoppel. Therefore, now we come to Motilal Padampat, which uses the expression promissory estoppel for the first time, but as I mentioned, is not the first case of promissory estoppel. Motilal Padampat sugar mills clearly qualifies as a locus classicus on the subject of the law of estoppel, promissory estoppel, an expression used by Justice Bhagavati for the first time in Indian courts. The learned judge also observed that this doctrine has been variously called by other names like equitable estoppel, quasi estoppel, new estoppel. In fact, new estoppel was the expression Dennings used. Indeed, the early cases did not speak of this doctrine of estoppel at all, but of raising an equity, an expression which found favor in Indo-Afghan as well. Why MP Sugar Mills treated is synonymous with promissory estoppel is from the sheer fact that though not being the first to apply the doctrine, it was definitely the first to threadbare discuss and elaborate on this principle of law and its various nuances. The facts in MP Sugar Mills were very straightforward. A 3-year tax holiday was announced for Vanaspati factories under the Uttar Pradesh Sales Tax Act for new. It was also confirmed by a letter of the Chief Secretary in January 1969. Based on the above announcement, the appellant, Motilal Padampat Sugar Mills, started setting up a new factory. However, in January 1970, the government announced that it will only be a partial concession for new factories. Agreed by this, the appellant approached the High Court by way of a writ seeking for full concession as earlier committed. Ironically, the plea of promissory estoppel was not originally taken at all, but only added by way of an amendment much later. The High Court, however, dismissed the writ petition, holding that the appellant had waived his right by accepting the part conditions which were offered by the state. On appeal, the Supreme Court held that the High Court was not right in holding that the appellant had waived its rights to exemption for two reasons. Firstly, the waiver was not specifically pleaded by the government, and in the absence of a specific pleading, there cannot be a finding against the appellant on waiver. And secondly, for a party to waive its rights, it must first be established that the party knew the rights which it was giving up. The Supreme Court held that in the present case, the doctrine of promissory estoppel was the basis on which the claim can be sustained. And since that doctrine was not yet very well known, it was not appropriate for it to hold that a party had waived such a right. It was in this background that the Supreme Court took up the matter and finally allowed the appeal, elaborately laying down on the law of promissory estoppel. The court traced the origin of the doctrine of promissory estoppel in English law as well as American jurisprudence, especially the former related to many old cases, including Hughes versus Metropolitan Railway and Birmingham and District Company versus Northwestern Railway, both old authorities of 1877 and 1888, which had been standing decisions a century ago by the House of Lords and which were only in 1946 rediscovered by Justice Denning, as he then was, in the High Trees and later reiterated by him in the Lyle Miller case. A very important facet of MP Sugar Mill's case was that it debunked the English law notion that in order to invoke estoppel, the parties must have had a contractual relationship of some kind. Both Hughes versus Metropolitan and Birmingham District Company, from which Denning drew inspiration for evolving the new equitable principles in High Trees, were clearly cases where the principle was applied as between parties who are already bound contractually to one another. These two decisions might therefore seem to suggest that the doctrine of promissory estoppel is limited in its operation to cases where parties are already contractually bound and one of the parties induces the other to believe that the strict rights under which the contract would not be enforced. The Supreme Court held, quote, but we do not think any such limitation can justifiably be introduced to curtail the width and amplitude of this doctrine. We fail to see why it should be necessary to the applicability of this doctrine that there should be some contractual relationship between the parties. Summarizing the principle, Supreme Court further held that the true principle of promissory estoppel therefore seems to be that where one party has by his words or conduct made to the other a clear and unequivocal promise which is intended to create a legal relationship or affect the legal relations to arise in the future, knowing or intending that it will be acted upon by the other party to whom the promise is made, and it is in fact so acted upon by the other party, the promise would be binding on the party making it, and he would not be allowed to go back upon it if it would be inequitable to allow him to do so, having regard to the dealings which have taken place between the parties. And this would be so irrespective of whether or not there is any pre-existing relationship between them. Yet another landmark departure from the traditional doctrine in MP Sugar Mills was the age-old concept that estoppel cannot create a cause of action and that it is a shield and not a sword. Justice Bhagwati wrote, I'm quoting, it may be pointed out that in England, the law has been well settled for a long time, although there is some indication of a contrary trend to be found in recent juristic thinking in that country, that promissory estoppel cannot itself be the basis of an action. It cannot found a cause of action. It can only be a shield and not a sword. This narrow approach to a doctrine, which is otherwise full of great potentialities, is largely the result of an assumption encouraged by its rather misleading nomenclature that the doctrine is a branch of the law of estoppel. Since estoppel has always been traditionally a principle invoked by way of a defense, the doctrine of promissory estoppel has also come to be identified as a measure of defense. The ghost of traditional estoppel continues to haunt this new doctrine. The Supreme Court further proceeded to hold that the doctrine need not be inhibited by the same limitation as traditional estoppel, and there was no reason why it should be limited only to a defense. So holding, the court also burst another myth between promissory estoppel and proprietary estoppel and stated that they were both offsprings of equity, and if the latter could be the foundation of an action, why not the former, so long as the end is to serve equity? The last important point decided in MP Sugar Mills was whether, in order to invoke this doctrine, any consideration was required. English law, as mentioned earlier, contemplated the use of this doctrine traditionally only in pre-existing relationships involving consideration. The Supreme Court busted this myth as well, holding that the modern attitude towards the doctrine of consideration is, however, changing fast, and there is a considerable body of juristic thought that believes that this is something of an anachronism. Being a child of equity, brought into the world with a view to promoting honesty and good faith, it must be allowed to fulfill the purpose for which it was born. It was in this context that Bhagwati J wrote that the law is not a mausoleum. So holding, the Supreme Court held that there was no requirement for any consideration for invoking promissory estoppel. A judgment as celebrated and more importantly, as revolutionary as MP Sugar Mills was bound to cause ripples everywhere. It did, but in the right places. This time, it was the Law Commission, chaired by none other than Justice K.K. Matthew, with jurists like Vepa Sarathi and P.M. Bakshi among other members. They submitted the 108th Law Commission report in December 1984, recommending inter alia an amendment to the Indian Contract Act by making a specific addition to Section 25, introducing promissory estoppel into the statute book and specifically made to apply against state and other authorities. The recommendations were entirely based on MP Sugar Mills case. Like most good recommendations of the Law Commission, this too made its way to the record room and stayed there. The report of the Commission, however, makes for excellent reading as they have independently analyzed the subject very thoroughly. Though the lawmakers may not have acted positively, an interesting turn in this subject took place a few years later in 1980. In the case of Jeet Ram versus State of Haryana, reported in AIR 1980 Supreme Court 1285, another co-equal bench of two judges of the apex court, while dealing with a very similar case involving octroi concessions which were reneged by the state, shockingly took a different view and held that MP Sugar Mills has not correctly understood the earlier judgment in Indo-Afghan, and the correct perspective was not to bind the state. So holding, the court diluted the entire concept of promissory estoppel and upheld the actions of the state of Haryana, withdrawing the tax benefits announced earlier. The bench held that the principles of promissory estoppel cannot be invoked against the executive functions of the state at all. It also held the state's defense of executive necessity to be a clear defense in that case. As it often happens, when two co-equal benches of the Supreme Court announce judgments conflicting with each other, while the law comes to a standstill, lawyers would thrive by citing MP Sugar Mills or Jeet Ram, depending on the side they were batting for. It took 6 long years, and funnily enough, a tobacco company fighting a central excise case to bring this dispute to a close. Bhagavati J had by then taken on the top chair as Chief Justice, and he constituted a 3-member bench with Justice Pathak and Justice Sen sitting with him to decide the case of Union of India versus Godfrey Phillips, reported in AIR 1986 Supreme Court, page 806. Dealing with a matter where the Central Excise authorities were going back on an earlier representation made to the Cigarette Manufacturers Association regarding the valuation of cigarettes, the court made the excise authorities be bound by that earlier representation into the industry, following the principles laid down earlier in MP Sugar Mills case. While so holding, the judgment was the Supreme Court held that the principles to be correctly followed would be the ones which had been laid down in the case of MP Sugar Mills, and they held that the pronouncement of the court in AIR 1980 Supreme Court in Jeet Ram versus State of Haryana to be bad law. MP Sugar Mills was therefore rightly restored to the correct legal position. While so doing, the court, however, cautioned that the principles of promissory estoppel would still not apply against legislative functions of the state. And also, for the first time, they put a caveat that promissory estoppel being a child of equity, it should also lead to a larger equity if pleaded and proved by the state in a given case. A couple of years later, in another case where promissory estoppel was invoked, though upholding the doctrine, on facts, the apex court declined to enforce the promise made by the railway board, offering to give concessional goods tariff to the Delhi Cloth and General Mills. The High Court had allowed the case relying on MP Sugar Mills, but on an appeal filed by the Union of India, the apex court reversed the High Court. The Supreme Court accepted the position that alteration of position was all that was needed to be established and that no damage or actual prejudice need be proved. However, the Supreme Court non-suited the petitioner on the facts that promissory estoppel cannot be used to compel the public body or the government to carry out a representation or a promise which is either contrary to law or which was outside their authority or power. It further held that for the purpose of finding whether an estoppel arises in favor of a person acting on the representation, it is necessary to look into the whole of the representation made. It is also necessary to state that the representation must be clear and unambiguous and not tentative or uncertain. References made to certain passages from Hasbury's Laws of England, 4th edition, volume 16, page 1071. The DCM case, which I have just referred, the report is 1988, 1 SCC, page 86. Several years later, in yet another case, arising as under a fiscal statute, namely the Customs Act, when the doctrine of promissory estoppel was invoked to enforce a notification granting duty exemption for certain goods, the Supreme Court upheld an order withdrawing the exemption, holding that the original exemption was by its very nature reasonable as it was not unequivocal. This was the case in Kasinka Trading Company versus Union of India, reported in 1995, 1 SCC, page 274. This was the first time the apex court dealt with the statutory power to withdraw notification and held that it would not be necessary for the state to prove overriding public interest so long as relevant reasons for withdrawal were contained within the statute. Though Kasinka was a big blow to the importers community who were banking on promissory estoppel to hold on to duty exemptions, the doctrine itself was not much watered down and still held forth, though made less applicable in exemption cases. However, in the next year, in the case of ITC Bhadrachalam versus Mandal Revenue Officer, reported in 1996, volume 6 SCC, page 634, a two-member bench of the Supreme Court once again sought to revisit the doctrine laid down in MP Sugar Mills by attempting to revert back to the law which has been held to be overruled in Jeetram's case. The facts of this case were very much like a classic case of promissory estoppel. The government of Andhra Pradesh had passed orders granting exemption from payment of certain land revenues for factories established in a certain area. They sought to go back on it by pleading that they had retrospectively made the earlier order inoperative. This actually found favor with the High Court and was affirmed on appeal by the Supreme Court. This was a clear blow to the enforcement of this doctrine, which, to quote Justice Bhagwati, was born out of equity and meant to destroy injustice. But injustice was perpetuated and a solemn promise was given a go-by with the imprimatur of the highest court of this country. I may here make a brief departure from the subject. There is an adage saying that hard facts make bad law.
Bad law.
In my close to 40 years of litigation experience, amend it slightly by saying hard clients also make bad law. So, often, if the petitioners were tobacco companies or gambling lottery companies or alcohol manufacturers, law will not yield to them very easily because by nature they are obnoxious businesses. Very rarely, in respect of these people, the courts have kept clear of their nature of business and stuck only to the law and given, for example, you have got the lottery case, Andraj, you have the Shawala's case, all were decided on legislative competence beautifully, irrespective of the obnoxious nature of the businesses. But in cases where like promissory estoppel, the nature of the business seems to often tilt the scales one way or the other, which is why in ITC Bhadrachalam, they tried to go back to Jeetram's case to deny benefit. Now, for a good 8 years after ITC Bhadrachalam, law was again in a state of flux. It finally required the proportion of a baby food company to restore MP Sugar Mills to its rightful place. In the case of State of Punjab versus Nestle Products, reported in 2004, volume 6 SCC, page 465, the Supreme Court dealt with a case where the milk product producers in Punjab were assured of certain abolition of purchase tax by the Chief Minister, and the same was widely publicized. It was even reiterated by the state's finance minister in his budget speech. Despite this promise, tax demands were made and a batch of writ petitions came to be allowed by the Punjab and Haryana High Court, relying on MP Sugar Mills case. The state appealed to the Supreme Court, relying on ITC Bhadrachalam. Justice Ruma Paul, speaking for the court, felt that judicial discipline required it to follow MP Sugar Mills since it had the approbation of a 3-judge bench in Godfrey Phillips. The court reiterated that Jitram was not good law and that ITC Bhadrachalam likewise was not good law and should not be followed in cases relating to promissory estoppel. Since then, without any further hiccups, this doctrine has held and been reiterated time and time again in a series of judicial pronouncements by the various high courts as well as the Supreme Court. Chronologically, some of the more important pronouncements were as follows. I am just quickly going to run through. I'm going chronologically. 2007, Speak versus Electricity Company, Electricity Inspector. 2008, UP Power Corporation versus Sun Steel and Alloys, and as well as LML Enterprises versus the State of UP. 2009, Safety Audio Services versus Dadar. 2009, another case which came from Kerala, PepsiCo versus State of Kerala. And 2000, State of Tamil Nadu versus Shyam Sundar. These are all reiterating the propositions, some granting the relief, some declining the relief. But the most recent case on this doctrine also arose from Kerala in the field of Kerala Building Tax Act. All the principles in earlier cases have once again been emphasized by Justice Rohinton Nariman in the case of Manuals and Hotels Private Limited versus State of Kerala, reported in AAR 2016 Supreme Court, page 2322. This was a very interesting case where Section 3A contained a power to exempt from payment of building tax, and such exemption was promised by the state government, accepting a recommendation of the central government to declare tourism as an industry. However, no actual notification was actually issued under Section 3A. The High Court declined to grant any relief, but on appeal, the Supreme Court committed the state government to its promise, notwithstanding that Section 3A itself had by then been deleted from the statute book. Indeed, I will end this part of my address quoting Justice Nariman from this case, being one of the latest. I now quote Justice Nariman. We must never forget that the doctrine of promissory estoppel is a doctrine whose foundation is that an unconscionable departure by one party from the subject matter of an assumption, which may be a fact or law, present or future, and which has been adopted by the other party as the basis of some course of conduct, act, or omission, should not be allowed to pass muster, and the relief to be given in cases involving the doctrine of promissory estoppel contains a degree of flexibility which should ultimately render justice to the aggrieved party. The law on promissory estoppel has now finally come to stay. The only doubt still lingering, in my mind at least, is regarding the inapplicability of the plea in opposition to legislative function. Motilal Padampat said it, again reiterated in Godfrey Phillips. But I am completely in line with that, as long as what is meant is that if a promise itself was illegal, meaning contrary to a statute, then the state cannot be compelled to perform that act. But what I am asking myself is that does this mean that if a promise is made by an executive and when made was well within its powers, can the state legislature overturn that promise by passing a law and thereby making the promise unenforceable? I think not. Maybe such a law is liable to be struck down as violative of Article 14 by invoking the doctrine of promissory estoppel and its twin brother, legitimate expectations. Certain observations on differentiating between a primary legislation and a delegated legislation in the UP Power Corporation case, as well as Manuals and Hotels, may not appear to favor me on this position. It's a very debatable proposition, which I will leave for another day while I go to the twin brother legitimate expectation. Legitimate expectation. When I chose this topic sometime in end of November, beginning December, when Padman contacted me, little did I realize that as far as the aspect of legitimate expectation is concerned, my task is going to be made completely easy. On 1st December 2020, less exactly a month back, Dr. Justice Y.V. Chandrachud, speaking for a bench of the apex court, delivered what I may truly state with admiration and respect a treatise on the subject of legitimate expectation. This was in the case of State of Jharkhand and others versus Brahmaputra Metallics Limited, reported in 2020 online SEC, page 968. Almost every important reported judgment on this subject, as well as the very history of development from estoppel to expectation, including tracing its overseas origin in English law, have been culled out and discussed threadbare. I would, however, try and deal with the subject before this August audience in my own way, though the treatment may be heavily influenced by Dr. Chandrachud. The one small information with which I will start is something which is actually not reflected in Justice Chandrachud's judgment, namely that subject to correction, the very first time the expression legitimate expectation was used in the Supreme Court, giving something in favor of a party, was arising from a judgment of this very High Court of Kerala, my own personal favorite court. It is the case of State of Kerala versus Madhavan Pillai, reported in AIR 1989 Supreme Court, page 49. More of this later. Conceptually speaking, the traditional English law treated promissory estoppel and legitimate expectation as parallel doctrines, estoppel dealing with private law and legitimate expectation in the realm of public law. In fact, D. Smith's judicial review recognizes this contrast when he states that it is not normally necessary for a person to have changed his position or to have acted to his detriment in order to qualify as a holder of legitimate expectation. He further adds that private law analogies from the field of estoppel are of limited relevance where a public law principle requires public officials to honor their undertakings and respect legal certainty, irrespective of whether loss has been incurred by the individual or not. Another crucial distinction made in English law traditionally was, as mentioned earlier, estoppel was only a shield and not a sword, whereas legitimate expectation has been recognized in English law to found a cause of action by itself. In India, this distinction is not there because on both counts, we have gone beyond the English doctrine. Firstly, we made promissory estoppel operate in public law from the threshold, and we have also made it a sword and not just a shield. It is therefore not very surprising that these two principles have often been used interchangeably when they are actually distinct and separate, even in our jurisprudence. In fact, Dr. Chandrachud says in the State of Jharkhand case that legitimate expectation is a concept much broader in scope than promissory estoppel. The explanation of this doctrine of legitimate expectation can rightly be quoted from a Queen's Bench judgment in the case of R versus East Devon Health Authority, reported in 2003 Queen's Bench, page 2 and 3. Their Lordship said, I'm quoting, where the court considers that a lawful promise or practice has induced a legitimate expectation of a benefit which is substantive, not simply procedural. Authority now establishes here that the court will, in a proper case, decide whether to frustrate the expectation is so unfair that to take a new and different course will amount to an abuse of power. Here, once the legitimacy of the expectation is established, the court will have the task of weighing the requirement of fairness against any overriding interest relied upon for the change in policy. The development of this doctrine in Indian law can really be traced to the 1989 judgment in the case of State of Kerala versus K.G. Madhavan Pillai, referred by me earlier. In this case, sorry, just in this case, the Supreme Court was dealing with a subsequent order of the state government keeping in abeyance an earlier order confirming certain benefits to aided schools in the state of Kerala. The order was struck down by the Kerala High Court primarily on the ground of violation of principles of natural justice. But when the state took it up on appeal, the Supreme Court, while confirming the High Court order, went into the aspect of legitimate expectations and also on the ground of violation of principles of natural justice, telescoping the two into one concept. The court quotes with approval certain passages from Wade on Administrative Law 5th edition, which ironically indicates that this doctrine of legitimate expectation was actually introduced in English law to restrict the right to be heard and was being used by courts with a very flexible criterion whereby they can reject unmeritorious or unsuitable claims. This is far from what we understand of the same doctrine on our jurisprudence as it did evolve even in England later. As I mentioned, this was the first time the doctrine was positively applied to strike down a state action. I must, however, admit that the very first reference to the word legitimate expectation had actually taken place 6 years earlier in the case of Ved Gupta versus Apsara Traders, reported in AIR 1983 Supreme Court, page 978, where the apex court, while dealing with a challenge to a non-renewal of a cinema theatre license, makes a passing reference that even a case of legitimate expectation was not made out. So I will still stand by the fact that Gopalan Pillai's case from the state of Kerala was the first case where legitimate expectation was used to sustain a right of a private citizen. Almost a decade later, a three-member bench of the Supreme Court had occasion to deal with this subject in the case of Food Corporation of India versus Kamadhenu Cattle Feeds, reported in 1993, 1 SCC, page 71. This was a case of a tender floated by the Food Corporation for sale of grains. After the respondent came out successful in the tender, FCI tried to reopen the bidding process and sought to award the tender to a third party. The Supreme Court held that legitimate expectation was ingrained both from rule of law as well as a doctrine of equity and non-arbitrariness enshrined in Article 14 of our Constitution. The court held as public authorities have been given authority and discretion to act for public good, a legitimate expectation is created amongst the mind of the public that the actions taken will always be fair. This is one case where the real interplay between Article 14 and legitimate expectation have been elaborated. I will then quote Justice Verma from this judgment. Quote, in contractual sphere, as in all other state actions, the state and all its instrumentalities have to conform to Article 14 of the Constitution, of which non-arbitrariness is a significant facet. There is no unfettered discretion in public law. A public authority possesses powers only to use them for public good. This imposes the duty to act fairly and to adopt a procedure which is fair play in action. Due observance of this obligation as a part of good administration raises a reasonable or legitimate expectation in every citizen to be treated fairly in his interaction with the state and its instrumentalities, with this element forming a necessity component of the decision-making process of all state actions. To satisfy this requirement of non-arbitrariness in a state action, it is therefore necessary to consider and give due weight to the reasonable or legitimate expectation of the person likely to be affected by the decision, or else that unfairness in the exercise of the power may amount to an abuse or excess of power apart from affecting the bona fides of the decision in a given case. This decision so made would be exposed to challenge on the ground of arbitrariness. Rule of law does not completely eliminate discretion in the exercise of power, as it is unrealistic, but provides for control of its exercise by judicial review. The very next year, the Supreme Court, while dealing with another tender matter which the railways had floated for purchase of cast steel bogies, where the lowest tendering party was subsequently denied the tender, finding that there had been a formation of a cartel, the challenge by the three suppliers based on legitimate expectation was negatived by the court, holding that not every change in policy was liable to be struck down by applying legitimate expectation, and that where the change is occasion to combat a negative trend, such as creating a monopoly or price fixation, the same would be reasonable fair to go back on the earlier decision. In the case of National Building Corporation versus S. Raghunathan in 1998, it's reported in volume 7 SCC page 66. A three-member bench of the Supreme Court was dealing with a case where there was a demand of certain engineers of the PW department for an increased farm allowance based on an increased pay scale, basic pay scale which had already been raised. The claim was founded on an alleged legitimate expectation that when their basic pay had been increased, other perquisites attached to the pay scale should also get increased pro rata. It was held that when the court finds that a policy has been reasonably formulated and it is non-arbitrary, any contrary legitimate expectation automatically stand displaced. This court finally held, Supreme Court finally held that the claims based on legitimate expectation have been held to require reliance on representation and resulting detriment to the claimant in the same way as claims based on estoppel. This I wanted to emphasize because I personally believe that this observation by their lordships may not be in line with Motilal Vadampat, where it specifically states that it need not have been acted upon. Justice Chandrachud justifiably comments that this judgment was based on the English law as it stood then. He also commented that it was also because there was a lot of conflation and overlap between these two doctrines, but it has since changed, even in England, more so because of a series of pronouncements by the English courts in the first few years of this millennium, such as R versus Sussex County Council, R versus Leicestershire County Council, and R versus Northeastern Devon and Health Authority. All judgments between 2001 and 2006. Putting it back, the law of legitimate expectation, putting it in line actually with the Indian law developed. Since the bedrock of legitimate expectation is fairness and reasonableness of state action, it naturally followed that invoking the Wednesbury's principles of natural reasonableness will not be far behind. And so it was in the very next year in 1999, in the case of Punjab Telecommunications versus Union of India, reported in 1994 4 SCC, the Supreme Court, while dealing with a case arising out of a tender matter, refused to interfere with the change in policy which affected the shortlisted suppliers. The challenge made was mounted on the basis that arbitrary change in policy had eroded legitimate expectation and held that status quo should continue. The Supreme Court, while accepting the contention that reasonableness in a policy is a sine qua non for not offending Article 14, a change in policy in order to defeat substantive legitimate expectation must satisfy the Wednesbury's test of reasonableness, holding that the change in that case was neither perverse nor irrational, but intended to advance a larger public good. The case on legitimate expectation was negative. The next case where this doctrine was discussed is the case of Banariam and Sugars versus Commercial Tax Officer in 2005. It's reported in volume 1, 2005 SCC, page 625. This was again a case involving a retrospective withdrawal of certain tax concessions given to sugar mills for purchasing cane from public sector and cooperative sugar farming bodies in Tamil Nadu. The withdrawal of the tax concession was challenged, invoking both the doctrine of promissory estoppel and legitimate expectation. The Supreme Court rejected both the claims since the unit was not set up based on that promise, but was already an existing undertaking. The claim of legitimate expectation was also repelled on the ground of supervening public equity or overriding public interest. The court relied upon a series of earlier cases like Sri Sales Corporation, Pavan Alloys, Sri Durga Oil Mills, all of which were cases involving withdrawal of tax concessions or other benefits. In each one of those cases, the Supreme Court had affirmed the decision of the state withdrawing those concessions. However, fortunately, in the Banariaman's case, that aspect of withdrawal with retrospective effect done by the state of Tamil Nadu was to be re-examined on the light of legitimate expectation. But what is more interesting is that the very next year, 2006, a bench of the Supreme Court was dealing with another case of withdrawal of tax concession, except this time it was by a tire manufacturer, MRF, against the demands made by the Commercial Taxes Department of the state of Kerala. This was a classic MP Sugar Mills case. The state of Kerala announced a tax holiday for 7 years to any new industry or substantial new expansion of an existing industry set up in the state. Based on that representation, MRF expanded their existing unit in Kottayam, investing several crores of rupees, and the same was approved by the state government for getting the tax benefit. Thereafter, the concession which was announced was sought to be withdrawn by the state midway before the 7 years could expire. The concession, the Supreme Court was dealing with the challenge made by MRF, distinguished Kasinka and all the line of judgments where such withdrawals were upheld earlier. The court also repelled the defense of there being
There is some audio problem, connectivity.
chose to rely upon a 20-year-old decision on promissory estoppel arising from another Kerala case in 1987 referred to as Purnami Mills Oil Mills case, which was on identical facts in AR 1987 Supreme Court. The Supreme Court finally quashed the withdrawal notification and directed the state of Kerala to honor the tax holiday for the full 7 years as originally promised. While this is a case based primarily on promissory estoppel, the court also resorted to the doctrine of legitimate expectation and elaborately discusses the same in the context of the unfairness of state action, quoting extensively from classic cases under Article 14, such as E.P. Rayappa, Ramana Dayaram, and so on. Therefore, the interplay between Article 14, reasonableness, and legitimate expectation were all getting telescoped into one. This interplay of the two doctrines of promissory estoppel and legitimate expectation came to be once again examined in 2012 by the Supreme Court in the case of Monet Ispat Energy versus Union of India, reported in 2012, volume 11 SEC, page 1, wherein they were reiterating the need for a representation from the state and action in prejudice to maintain an action under while the case under legitimate expectation, they said, is more founded on the basis of a state's action to be fair and reasonable. This judgment in Monet was again reaffirmed by Chief Justice Thakkar a few years later in the case of Union of India versus Lieutenant Colonel P.K. Chowdhury, reported in 2016, volume 4 SEC, page 236. Justice Thakkar, referring to certain foreign jurisprudence, including Australian cases, held that the denial of legitimate expectation in a given case is actually a denial of a guaranteed right against arbitrariness, discretion, abuse of power, or violation of natural justice, all of which emanate in our Constitution from its bedrock, namely Article 14. This is why Dr. Chandrachud observed in the state of Jharkhand's case last month that the doctrine of legitimate expectation is one of the ways in which the guarantee of non-arbitrariness enshrined under Article 14 finds concrete expression. This brings us to the last judgment, the state of Jharkhand versus Brahmaputra Metallics, decided last month. This was another case where certain exemptions from electricity duty promised by the state of Jharkhand under an industrial policy announced in 2012 for a period of 5 years was sought to be withdrawn, was never implemented. The difference in this case was that pursuant to the notified policy, a follow-up notification was required to be issued within 1 month, setting out the duty exemption, and this was never done by the state of Jharkhand. A mandamus was issued by the High Court directing the issuance of a notification under the Bihar Act. However, in compliance with that mandamus, the notification issued in 2015 did not date back to 2012 and was made only prospective. So what is to happen to the period from 2012 to 2015? The matter went to the Supreme Court. The issue decided by the High Court at the first instance was whether the industries were entitled to the benefit from 2012 itself, or alternately, should it be for a period of 5 years starting from 2015. It preferred the former relief. The High Court then placed very heavy reliance on the apex court's orders in MP Sugar Mills, Manuel Sons Hotel, and the case of the state of Bihar versus Kalyanpur Cements, which is a 2010 Supreme Court case. The last referred case, in fact, the state of Bihar versus Kalyanpur Cement, was literally on identical facts as the state of Jharkhand's case. The challenge to the state action, like in several earlier cases referred by me, was based both on promissory estoppel as well as legitimate expectation. On an appeal by the state of Jharkhand, the Supreme Court elaborately discusses the law of estoppel and expectation and finally upholds the High Court judgment by holding that the state of Jharkhand was under a constitutional obligation to have issued the follow-up notification within 1 month, and having failed to do so, cannot restrict the duty exemption from 2015 when the units were entitled to the same from 2012 itself. The court also found no overriding public interest that caused the state not to issue the notification within 1 month in 2012. The actions were consequently held to be arbitrary and violative of Article 14. While I would have liked to have ended on a positive note with the above judgment, which embodies and gives life to both the doctrines we have discussed, I will be amiss if I did not also refer to another judgment pronounced in April 2020 by Justice Arun Mishra, wherein the Supreme Court upheld withdrawals of incentives given to new industries established post the earthquake in the Kutch region. The government of India, in order to boost Kutch, which was hit by the earthquake, announced a slew of concessions for new industries to be set up, and several industrialists went put up new industries there. After they put it up, the government of India decided to withdraw the concessions, and the alleged reason for the withdrawal of those concessions was that several unscrupulous elephants have also come into the act, and they are trying to get an unfair advantage of those tax benefits. Now, this reason that several unscrupulous units had been claiming benefits not due to them found favor with the Supreme Court, even though the High Court, with great respect, had rightly interfered with the improved actions based on the two doctrines. But on appeal, the Supreme Court reversed the High Court, holding that the reasons given for scrapping the entire scheme was not hit by the doctrine of legitimate expectation, as it was issued in larger public interest and to safeguard public revenue. The Supreme Court further held that the impugned notifications did not take away any vested right and was not hit by promissory estoppel. The court even went to the extent of upholding the retrospective withdrawal of the notifications benefits as well, even to bona fide users. I only ask myself this: if some mischief makers seek to unfairly take benefits not due to them, would you deprive the same to other honest beneficiaries, and that too retrospectively? I will leave it to you all to ponder over this question while I conclude this address. I had to edit to this judgment because it is staring at my face. It depicts everything which I've spoken in the previous 40 minutes on promissory estoppel and legitimate expectation. But the truth is, April 2020, this judgment is there. December 2020, you have State of Jharkhand's judgment. So are we now going back to a situation in 2021 like we were in the 1980s between Motilal Pasanpat Sugar Mills and Jeet Ram? We will have to wait and see for all of us how we are going to deal with it. I usually do not refer to much case laws, and whenever I do any public address, I like to temper my speech with some element of levity and humor. I must really ask your collective forgiveness to have been too serious and, more importantly, cited too many case laws. The reason is that the topic which I chose is entirely based on judicial pronouncements and nothing else. I thank you all for your forbearance, and I am open to any discussions or questions which you might have. Or even generally comment on what you felt. Anything. I'll mute myself when you're talking.
Shyam?
Shyam, sir.
There is a ghost.
Yeah.
Oh,
No.
I'm in a boat. In fact, I'm in a boat.
my goodness. Oh,
Sir, you can see the boat.
you are.
Kumar sir.
Raman sir, you will have to unmute. You have muted yourself.
I think Mr. Raman, Bharat Raman, I think you'll have to unmute yourself. I think there's a video failure there.
Could be.
Because the...
Raman sir, you will have to unmute.
Yes.
Okay. May I request Shyam, sir, please.
Oh no, I've joined late, so I think the delay may first be cut down.
Promissory estoppel is even in whatever stage you can join, it's promissory estoppel, sir.
No, first the delay has to be cut down before it is taken up.
The promise doesn't vanish.
Raman sir,
Justice Swamy, fortunately, had filed a condone delay petition yesterday evening itself.
BCCI did have the privilege of having both of you. So I think like Shyam, sir, all yours.
We have spent very pleasant evenings when we were both in the BCCI legal committee.
Thank you. In fact, I'm coming back after a long time. I missed the last few sessions. And Bharat Raman, as usual, it was much more than I expected. It was such a pleasure to hear you. No wonder you are such a respected and sought after counsel in Madras. Thank you so much. Wonderful exposition of law. The entire gamut of issues were very, very succinctly explained. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Judge. Thank you so much.
No. And I'm glad I'm back. Today, in fact, I bent a few rules to leave the court early, so I can't say it. I'll talk to you in private. I think, Ramkumar sir, you should take over, sir.
Okay. This was more than our legitimate expectation. Excellent articulation, studded with appropriate case law. And now the waxing and waning of the judicial pronouncements were very beautifully sketched by you, Mr. Raman. Now, am I right in saying that if the promise was valid at the time when it was made, then any subsequent removal of the substratum of the promise will be of no consequence in relation to the alteration of the position made by the promisee to his detriment? Am I right?
Correct. Absolutely. In fact, the only caveat which the Supreme Court uses is that we will not apply it to sovereign functions.
Okay. And against law.
Functions. And of course, now they are of late also applying the public interest principle. What they are now saying is that since promissory estoppel is actually a creature of equity.
Yes.
If there is a larger public equity which is involved, we may not want to possibly enforce that promise.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
larger public equity will have to be really pleaded and proved by the authorities to a point where it can make it take away from the original promise.
Yes. And notwithstanding COVID hand sanitizers, person who approaches the court will have to come with clean hands to claim equity.
Absolutely, absolutely. That in fact, coming to court with clean hands in cases involving either promissory estoppel or legitimate expectation is a sine qua non. Because
Yes.
both are principles of equity. So there is no way you can't come with unclean hands and try to ask for those reliefs.
Exactly.
No way.
Exactly.
No way. No way.
Notwithstanding all hand sanitizers.
You can come with unclean hands in a tax case and just say that I'm entitled to this tax because of the interpretation of the section, but not in equity. Not in equity.
Yes. Beautifully put, sir. Beautiful. Wonderful. Is that Lotus Hotels case also based on promissory estoppel? Is it not?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Lotus
Lotus
Hotels.
Hotels again on promissory estoppel.
Yes,
It was again a case of withdrawing a permission.
I remember to have cited that ruling in a case conducted by
Yes. In fact, I must be candid. Legitimate expectation, more or less, most of the cases I have covered. But in promissory, there must be at least another 20-30 cases of importance, which I could not for point of view of time constraints. Lotus is one. In fact, Turner Morrison was something I could have even addressed a little more because, as Justice Sri.P.S.Raman knows, it's a very, very oft-quoted case in commercial law. Turner Morrison versus Hungerford investment is always quoted, and that elaborate discussions on promissory estoppel has taken place. There are several.
Thank you.
You are absolutely right, Justice Ramkumar. That Lotus Hotels is a prime case of promissory estoppel.
They directed the institution to pay the amount also.
Exactly.
Please pay.
It was a positive mandamus, yes.
Positive mandamus. Yeah.
Yes. Wonderful. I am fully civilized on this branch of law.
Any other
Yes,
question?
Mr. Ramakrishnan. What happened to Ramakrishnan? He disappeared.
Some questions.
Ramakrishnan.
There's somebody who has asked me, good evening, how much the doctrine of estoppel is applicable to minors, especially in divorce or maintenance cases. See, the matter of maintenance and divorce cases, minors actually, the estoppel principle may not really strictly apply, because what happens in those cases, I'm not a specialist in that branch of law, but speaking from general practice, I can tell you that whenever an issue involving a minor comes up in maintenance divorce cases, whether it is for guardianship,
Custody,
etc., the High Court acts as patriarch parentis. The High Court becomes the parent of the child in that case.
Exactly.
At that point of time, the interest of the child is the only thing the court is looking at, not the interest of the parents, all the legal rights of the husband or the wife. So in that case, in that sense, the doctrine of estoppel will not, that cannot be estoppel. The father, the mother, there cannot be an estoppel on that, because ultimately the court will waive every consideration and only look at the interest of the child.
Yes, paramount concern of the welfare of the child.
Yes, exactly.
There's a more dangerous question preceding that. Does promissory estoppel apply to marriage? That is particularly dangerous.
I think legitimate expectation has a better chance.
Does it apply to marriage? Is very interesting.
On such false promises, rapes have been committed.
I know. That is the new emerging area.
Yes. And Supreme Court has also held that such false promises does not amount to consent.
Yes. Becomes, yes. Any other questions on this? But I really want you to look at both state of Jharkhand as well as that Justice Arun Mishra's latest judgment, and see whether you can reconcile the two, because I was in my own mind finding it too contrasting.
Yes.
Yeah, very difficult to reconcile the two. So both are two judge benches. So I don't know whether how it is pan out over the next year or two. Now, funnily enough, no case went to the Constitution bench.
Exactly.
Otherwise, it would have been nobody can then move around in the realm.
Yeah.
You see. But did that 1951 Supreme Court?
One small correction. I do believe that in our Pottusamy case, right to privacy case, the 9 judges have referred to legitimate expectation and in the context of right to privacy. There is some about it. If I'm not mistaken, I want to have a relook at, because something which one of my colleagues had also told me. Apparently, there is some reference to legitimate expectation in the context of right to privacy in Pottusamy's case.
Okay. So was not that 51 Supreme Court a constitutional bench? Collector of Bombay?
51 Supreme Court was a constitutional bench. That was a constitutional bench.
But then the law was
Justice
not
S.R. spoke for the court.
Yes.
It has not evolved so much.
Yes.
They merely held the state of Bombay which promised and left it at that.
Yes.
Overriding public interest, contrary interest coming in and all that was not available there, because state of Bombay had no business to make the demand. 70 years the Bombay Municipal Corporation had occupied that land. They took it back from them voluntarily by promising them, I will build it and give it to you interest free, and then demanded interest. That's why the Supreme Court had to interfere there. They could not plead it. Even if they had pleaded financial prejudice or something, I don't think the judgment would have gone any different way.
So good evening, Sanjay Pinto here. Yes, I missed a bit of your talk. I have a question, sir, if you don't mind.
Yeah, go ahead, Sanjay.
So would the doctrine of promissory estoppel apply to law students who in the middle of their course are faced with a new rule introduced by the Bar Council? Like, for instance, when I studied law from 94 to 97, I think in 96, the Bar Council introduced a compulsory apprenticeship rule. As a result of which, when I graduated in 97, I could not, of course, I didn't get enrolled at that point. So will promissory estoppel apply in cases where while joining a course, I'm under a legitimate belief that at the end of 3 years, I will be eligible for enrollment. But the Bar Council, the regulatory body, comes in and says, no, in the middle of your course, you will have to undergo 1 year of compulsory apprenticeship. Later on, it was struck down by the Supreme Court. But in such cases, yes, sir.
Yeah. Sanjay, if I were to defend Bar Council,
yes, sir.
The defense I would take is that I am not changing the goalpost in the middle of the course. I'm only introducing one more aspect of procedure which has got to be gone through by them. Because the 1 year apprenticeship, they may say, is a matter of something which is a matter of prudence which we have now introduced. By doing that, we are not in any way delaying. We are only, your right to enroll has been delayed by a year, definitely. But plead that it is in larger public interest, because having a 1 year apprenticeship would better shape the students before they come to practice. So I'm not too sure whether a challenge to that on grounds of promissory estoppel or legitimate expectation might have succeeded.
What about will it fall under a reasonable restriction under 19.6, sir? I mean, my right under 19.1G.
Certainly, it will be reasonable. It will be a reasonable restriction, because they are only asking you to go through a training program, like an apprenticeship or something like that, an internship, which, by the way, is mandatory in most other countries in the world. You can't practice in the United States to become a lawyer in New York, state of New York's bar. Sometimes people have to write that exam 3 or 4 times to pass it. It's like chartered accountancy examination.
Absolutely, and most professions also, like house surgeons and all that, from
yes.
So
and that right is not denied. Right is not denied, only delayed.
That's true, but then you're elongating a course by another year. So
true. Sanjay, it would have made a difference if they had a 4th year as a student.
All for the betterment. No.
Yes.
All for
They
the
made it a
betterment of the.
fourth year by adding some subjects. It might be struck down.
So what about talking about New York example? And recently there was a lady who got enrolled at the age of 75 in New York, I was told. Again, the bar councils moved to put a cap on the age for enrollment. If a student has already joined a law course under a legitimate belief that at the end of it they will be allowed to enroll, and if midway to the course, if this age cap is introduced, will promissory estoppel apply in such cases also, sir?
The age cap was for people over 45 who have retired and are joining the profession.
Exactly.
Not for the youngsters.
Yes.
Not for youngsters. It is for people above 45, etc., who are trying to come into the profession. As a result, the youngsters are being deprived.
And that too, just so many, for the first time they are trying to come in at the age of 45.
Exactly.
Because there are people, for example, who have enrolled in as lawyers, thereafter suspended their practice because they have become in-house counsel of some company or they have taken up corporate employment or something like that. Then at the age of 58 or 60, they retire. They can come back. Council is under an obligation to give them back their certificate.
Yes.
They
Revival.
Restriction against them.
It's only revival of the practice.
Yes, exactly.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Sanjay, by the way, I just want to introduce you all to him. He was one of the senior journalists. He gave up his journalism and came back to law, practice of law.
Okay, okay.
Thank you,
It's
sir.
a must for a journalist also.
So thanks to that 97 rule, today when they see my Wakalat enrollment of 2012 after I left NDTV, they think I'm very young. So that's a good thing, actually, the flip side. Thank you, sir.
Anything else?
Sir, we have Virupaksha, sir. Prem, can you just unmute him?
Thank you, sir. It would have taken several months for us to read all these decisions. It was very so simple. I just have one doubt, sir.
Yes, please.
In case where promissory estoppel is not enforced on the ground of overriding public interest or whatever it is, can the state be forced to restore status quo ante or make some compensation?
To recompense the party for what it had suffered because it had changed its position. Unfortunately, there has been no such case of restitution till now. In fact, in one case involving Union Territory of Pondicherry, where we could not invoke, we tried invoking promissory estoppel, but it was thrown out on the ground of overriding public interest. We were seriously considering whether we could file a suit for money suit for compensation. But there, overriding public interest can't be a defense because I have acted on a representation. I have put it up for what I have done till now. Give me. I'm not saying I need the right. My right to continuance may be taken away by overriding public interest. But what happens to the investment I had already made? Because that was the case where almost 20-25 crores of investment had already taken place into a SEZ. When thereafter they pulled it out on overriding public interest. But the party didn't go to court. I think they were already broke by the time they spent the 12 crores and then spent some more on me.
Really suffered the detriment.
Thank you, sir.
Sir, we have Shyampadmanassociates from Chennai. Shyampadmanassociates,
Yes, sir.
sir, Prem, can you just unmute him?
Wait.
You are drifting in troubled waters, Mr. Shyam.
I'm in a very, very troubled water, sir.
Yeah, Shankar-Raman, you can unmute.
Good evening, sir. Good evening, sir. Am I
Yes,
audible?
Raman. Very
Am
well.
I audible?
Very much. Very much.
Sir, actually, we engaged for the Tata Titanium project in Tirunelveli District Court.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Actually, we engaged your office junior, Mr. N.R. Chandran, sir, and you appeared for the state of Tamil Nadu, sir. And when
NRC, sir, appeared for Tatas, I appeared for state.
Tata Titanium, and we won the case, sir. But even though the appeal is pending in the High Court, but Tata Titanium project is not yet come. If it is really come to Tirunelveli, only because of your argument, we won the case. And when I joined the college, Your Honor, at that time, your brother is my classmate, Mr. Agram. Your brother,
I think he's watching it somewhere.
Yes, yes, yes. So, as far as the subject is concerned, I am only a Mobile Court advocate, and so you are the mentor for all the juniors in Tamil Nadu, and we are happy to hear your thing. Thanks, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Shankaraman sir.
Thank you.
Over to you, Prem.
Well, sir, that was a wonderful lecture, a wonderful class. And right from the early decisions till the latest Brahmaputra Metallics case, you took us to almost every ruling on this particular point. Thank you so much, sir.
In fact, Prem, just deviating from that for a moment, this thing of mine of wanting to get to the facts before I read judgment
Correct, sir. Correct.
is something I learned from Kapil Sibal.
Correct, sir.
30 years back when I was briefing Kapil in the Indian Olympics Association matter, give a judgment to him and tell him, para 23 and 24 of this judgment, I think may be a point in our favor, and I'll give it to him. And quickly tell me, Bharat, show me para 1 and 2. He said, I will first read that. I want to know what is the facts on which this judgment has been given. Because very often, if the facts are completely unconnected, any judgment can be distinguished.
That's why
So in all these cases, I insisted that I must add 3 sentences about what the facts were in which they came and gave that judgment. Otherwise,
absolutely. That's why in Ambika Kaur and in that Paltiana Sugar Mills case, the Supreme Court goes on to say little change of facts here and there can make a lot of difference.
Complete. Look at it in this particular discussion which we had earlier today. What is the difference between the MRF case and Bannari Amman's case? The only difference was in MRF, after the announcement was given by the state of Kerala, they invested the money and therefore the court interfered. In Bannari Amman, it was already a pre-existing fact. The Supreme Court felt no need for you to give any relief. You have not altered that position. So even a small fact like that will make the entire difference to the outcome.
And sir, if I heard you right, in that Motilal Sugar Mills case, which you cited, that's 79-2 SCC 409.
Yes.
Justice Bhaktari actually wasn't this pretty, I mean, the traditional concept of this doctrine of this promissory estoppel only applying as a shield. Was that totally debunked in that particular matter?
No. What he debunked were 3 things. He debunked the earlier concept that promissory estoppel cannot be a sword, it can only be a sword. He says, no, you can found a cause of action with that. Second thing he debunked was whether there should be a pre-existing contractual relationship between the people in order to invoke promissory estoppel. He said no such pre-existing contractual relationship is required. Third thing he debunked was there need not be a law of consideration for promissory estoppel.
Correct. That is detrimental.
It's all only a child of equity.
Correct.
So that he brought in and then directed the state. You promised something, do it.
But sir, let me ask you like this way. Now the scope of the doctrine of legitimate expectation, don't you feel that it is much more wider than this doctrine of promissory estoppel?
100%. 100%, Prem. In fact, Dr. Chandrachud says so in so many words in state of Jharkhand. Says that promissory estoppel is taking you this far, but legitimate expectation is a notion.
Correct.
What happens is there are a few judges here who will agree with me. The thing is with legitimate expectation is because it's a ocean, their lordships will be even more very strict about how to enforce it because otherwise it will become an unbridled horse. You can invoke legitimate expectation. Therefore, sometimes if you've got a case on promissory estoppel, you are more likely to succeed because that's on a very restricted facts of the case. Correct. There is a promise made, you have acted on it, and you have suffered because of its withdrawal.
Very true, sir. Very true.
Shown the court will give you relief. Whereas when you come to legitimate expectation, then it's a concept of how unfairly has the state treated you. There you are getting it. While the inquiry may be larger, the interference will be more narrow at the end of the day.
Correct. Because the Indian law, it was not conducive to much clarity until that first one is that Motilal Sugar Mills case and subsequently clarified by the recent ruling of Justice Chandrachud. All the other rulings not conducive to much clarity because usually it is conflicted because these two doctrines.
No, what happens? Right, Prem, what happens is of all the judgments I cited, it will always be some 50-50. In half the cases, finally relief might have been granted, and half the cases relief would not have been granted. But that is true not of this topic alone. You take any case, you will be surprised that some of the top judgments of the Constitution bench of the Supreme Court, which have laid down the law, finally the petitioner who moved it got nothing. It's
Correct.
starting with no, this one, our airport authority, Ramana Dayaram Shetty, Ajay Hasya, none of them finally got released at the end. But the law has been laid down for the world.
Locust and I, etc.
Exactly. Law was laid down, but they are so likewise even in this promissory estoppel legitimate expectation. That's why there are cases and cases. In fact, if you start making a chart, a line chart of all these judgments, you will find sometimes some identical cases are there, and in one case there was relief, one case there was no relief. That happens. It's part of the.
Yes.
We can't do
Under the
anything.
inconsistency of the apex court.
Sometimes it happens. You can't blame them, and you can't also these things because there again you might have to think some small fact would have made a difference.
Yes.
Some small fact, it might have been some small element of conduct by the party which should have gone into their head saying, "Oh, I'm not going to give relief to this fellow."
Yes.
That is a brilliant exposition, and to borrow the words of Justice Ramkumar, it was a forensic treat on these two documents.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, Prem. I mean, if I say legitimate expectation, it will be an euphemism, or I would say that it is an understatement. This is what we expected. This is what we got also. Wonderful evening well spent, sir. I mean, that too in, like Ramkumar sir said, in deep waters and troubled waters. It's wonderful. And,
Thank you.
Thank you
for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you. Such a pleasure.
Till we meet again, and I would like to place on record our indebtedness to Justice Ramkumar sir, Justice Ramakrishnan sir, and Justice Somayajulu sir for this wonderful evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
What about tomorrow, Shyam?
Tomorrow we have, we have a surprise tomorrow. Justice Kodandaram sir is going to address us tomorrow. And
wonderful.
we are going to be electrified because it is going to be electricity loss.
Oh, electricity loss. Okay, lovely.
And he's a contrarian.
So, sir, till we meet again tomorrow, let us get our energy levels up and hopefully not in the water. I would like to, get out of this water and hopefully.
Thank you,
sir.
Thank you.